A man's shadow casts dimly over a gravestone. Hunched over, he can be heard muttering under his breath, frantically praying for forgiveness. He touches the gravestone and stands, looking up begrudgingly to the downpouring sky. This man was Benfica and Portuguese legend Eusébio. You see, the next day, Benfica were to play AC Milan in the European final, and Eusébio was hoping to receive forgiveness from a man named Bela Guttmann. Forgiveness from a curse that had been put on his beloved club many, many years ago. Our story starts here in Lisbon, with Bela Guttmann walking into a barber shop. He had just become manager of Benfica a few months prior, and he happened to sit down next to his friend and former Brazil international José Carlos Bauer, who tells him he had just been on tour in Africa with his team. Intrigued, Guttmann asks him if he'd seen any promising talent, as he trusted José's analysis of the game. José said, "Yeah, there's this black kid named Eusébio. I wanted to buy him myself, but the fools are asking 20,000 euros for him." At the time, Eusébio da Silva Ferreira was playing for a club in Mozambique called Sporting Lourenço Marques, considered a satellite club of bitter rivals Sporting. But after finding out that they were also seeking Eusébio's signature, immediately Guttmann went about offering the 18-year-old a contract to sign for Benfica. This was not an easy signature to get, as Guttmann had to hide Eusébio in Lagos for 12 days to prevent his adversaries from trying to steal him back, as Sporting considered this player to be theirs. This effort, though, would be proven to be well worth it just a year later, as Benfica had a friendly match coming up against Pele's Santos. By the end of the first half, the Brazilian had already scored a brace and his team were up 4-0, so Guttmann decided to throw on the kid. What's there to lose? Eusébio casually strolled onto the pitch with the king and proceeded to one-up him, scoring a second-half hat-trick on his debut. Not too shabby for 20,000 euros, which would have been accounting for inflation just under 1 million euros today. And after the game, Guttmann proclaimed that he had struck gold. Eusébio's signing would be the catalyst of a legendary era for Benfica. You see, over the 2 seasons prior to his arrival, Benfica's league dominance had begun to fade, as they had lost out on the league titles twice, both to Sporting and Porto. So when Guttmann arrived on his first day in charge, he fired 20 players from the first team, and proceeded to bring in mostly youth, including Eusébio, to replace them. Absolutely ruthless behavior. And while this might seem pretty far out there, this Hungarian tactician was not one to shy away from these types of extravagant displays of power. For example, we have the time where he left his role as manager of Hungarian club Kispest because of a situation where he decided to substitute a player, but his captain at the time, and legendary striker Ferenc Puskás, denied his orders and told the player not to leave the field. Guttmann left the club on his own accord right after the game. Then we also had the time that he was head coach of AC Milan, and he got into a bar fight with Sampdoria's manager the day before he was to play them, and they ended up losing. As a result, Milan fired him even though they were in first place at the time, to which Guttmann responded, "I have been sacked even though I am neither a criminal or a homosexual." Guttmann would later add a clause to every single contract he signed that stated he could not be fired if he was at first place in the table. Clearly, there was some type of rhyme and reason to his style, as at the end of his first season at Benfica, the club had reclaimed the league title. Then, in the following season, they defended it and added to their success by winning Benfica's first ever European Cup, beating Barcelona in Vienna. Then, in the following season, he again led Benfica to another European Cup victory, beating Real Madrid 5-3 with help from an Eusébio brace, making them one of only 8 other teams in history who have won back-to-back European Cup or Champions League titles. Not too shabby for his first 3 seasons at the club. And that's probably what Bela Guttmann was thinking to himself, as after this feat, he met with the board to propose an increase in his salary. This request was, unfortunately for Benfica, rejected. Apparently, beating both Barcelona and Real Madrid in back-to-back European Cup finals was not enough for Benfica's president to warrant a pay raise. So outraged at what must have felt like an utter disgrace to his accomplishments, Guttmann would declare, "Not in the next 100 years will Benfica ever be European champions again," and storm out of the club, never to return. Subsequently, over the next 6 years, Benfica would reach the European Cup final 3 times, and go on to lose every single one of them. In '63, they went up early against AC Milan from an Eusebio goal, but Altafini scored twice in the second half to prevent Benfica from winning a 3rd time in a row. In '65, they were to face Inter Milan this time, but would succumb to a horrible mistake by goalkeeper Costa Pereira. Then in '68, they played United at Wembley and took it to extra time with a late equalizer, but couldn't survive extra time against George Best, Brian Kidd, and Bobby Charlton, and ended up losing 4-1 in extra time. And if Benfica's players and supporters didn't believe in the curse before, they certainly had more than enough reason to now. And after this 3rd failure in a row, the club would not reach a European Cup final for another 30 years. In 1983, however, they did qualify for a UEFA Cup final, which is the modern-day equivalent to the Europa League, and lost another final, this time against Anderlecht. 5 years after that, they would finally have another chance to put Bela Guttmann's curse to bed, as they cruised into the European Cup final, even beating Anderlecht along the way for that sweet, sweet revenge. It's Benfica vs PSV in the 1988 European Cup final, and after 120 minutes of deadlocked football, the referee blows the whistle for penalties. The players one by one cleanly dispatch all 5 of their spot kicks, and after PSV score their 6th, club captain Antonio Veloso steps up for Benfica to take charge and keep his team in the game to give them a possible glimpse of lifting a European trophy for the first time in 36 long years. Eusebio watches on in horror as Veloso's penalty is saved and PSV and Ronald Koeman lift their first European trophy. Now, to give credit to Benfica, instead of accepting their fate as being cursed by the ghost of Guttmann, they picked themselves back up, and 2 seasons later, they were right back in the thick of it, and demolished their opposition, putting them into the semi-finals, where they beat Marseille's Didier Deschamps and Enzo Francescoli for the spot in the 1990 final against AC Milan, the team that beat them in 1963, the year the curse was first put upon them by Guttmann. And the game was to be played in Austria, Vienna, the city where he was put to rest. The synchronicity here was way too crazy to ignore, and Eusebio was again reminded of the past. He couldn't bear to see his beloved club suffer anymore, so he makes his way to a graveyard in Vienna. Sven Eriksson's Benfica lines up against AC Milan in an astonishingly atmospheric pre-match display. Eusebio watches from the bench, now taking on a coaching role, hoping that his prayers were heard from the night before. But as fate would have it, this Milan team wasn't just your average run-of-the-mill Italian side. This particular side are remembered in footballing lore as the Immortals, and they had just won the European Cup the year prior, a side including the likes of Ruud Gullit, Carlo Ancelotti, Franco Baresi, Frank Rijkaard, Van Basten, and Paolo Maldini. And 2 years later, this team would go on to have the first ever invincible season in Serie A's history. It was almost as if there was some inexplicable force going against Benfica, putting them up against such difficult obstacles like this. And unsurprisingly, Rijkaard scores the only goal of the match to give Milan their back-to-back European final wins. Benfica had now lost 7 finals in a row, and would subsequently fall under dark times in regards to European football. The early 2000s and onwards would see a revolution of cash influx from global TV deals, and European heavyweights outside of the top 5 leagues would find it more and more difficult to compete in the now rebranded UEFA Champions League. As a result, it wouldn't be until 2013 that Benfica would qualify for another European final. But how could this really be? Why should you trust the words of just one bitter man? Well, Guttmann was not just any one man. This Hungarian Jew was born into war, multiple ones, revolution, and famine. He survived the torture and brutality of the Holocaust and even successfully led and planned an escape from a concentration camp. And even after all of this, he led a successful managerial career across some of the biggest teams in the world and is accredited with inventing the 4-2-4 formation at São Paulo, which was later adopted by the Brazilian national team, paving the way for their first World Cup victory in 1958, the birth of a colossal footballing giant. So let's just say he might have known a little something about what he was talking about, maybe some sort of premonition. After being away from a European final for a lengthy bout of 23 years, Benfica had finally made it to the 2013 Europa League final against Chelsea in Amsterdam, the city where Guttmann had first spoken the curse into existence. But as fate would have it, they succumbed to a looping Ivanovic header in extra time. And the week prior, they had lost the title in the last game of the season to Porto, in a last-second Kelvin winner. And to make things even worse, the next week, they would go on to lose the cup final to Vitória Guimarães, conceding 2 late goals. It must have felt like things couldn't get any worse from here. Benfica's goalkeeper Arthur stated, "I can't explain it. How can we explain it? There's no logical reason why we've lost 2 such big games right at the end." And then, just 7 months later, Eusebio would pass away, unfortunately having to suffer witnessing his beloved team continue the curse exactly 50 years later. But it gets even worse. The following season, Benfica would make it to the Europa League final again, this time against Sevilla. And at this point, I don't even have to say it, do I? A heartbreaking loss in penalties to take it to 9 final defeats in a row. The only team to have any record close to this is Atletico Madrid, who, since winning the UEFA Cup in 1962, have lost every single one of the 5 finals they've played in. Fortunately for them though, they don't have the ghost of a crazy Hungarian maniac haunting them until 2063, which is the year Guttmann's curse on Benfica is set to expire. And I know some of you may be getting ready to type in the comments, but what about Benfica's U19 Champions League final victory? Well, let me answer you by asking a question back. Since when did the U19 squad's trophies count towards the consideration of the first team? But what do you guys think? Does the U19 victory count towards the curse, or will Benfica be able to break it on their own accord before 2063?